Hello. Today I'm starting a series discussing the integration of the New York school system in the early 60s, really throughout the 60s. I was a part of that. I was part of the first group of what we called back in those days Negro students. We used Negro before the word black became popular, and then later Afro-American. Very, very pivotal decade, the 1960s. I started out in New York City, of course, and I grew up in New York City. And all of my experiences with school integration were in New York City. I spent the kindergarten, first and second grades in a predominantly black school in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, not too far from Bushwick. And I look back on those three grades, the kindergarten, first and second, with fond recollection. Those were my days of innocence. I went to a school that's still standing. It's PS 70. Now it's a charter school. Back in 2015, 2016, that winter, I was not well. I had cancer, and I wanted to go back and see places that I hadn't seen since I was a child. And I went back and saw that school and took some pictures of things. And it just brought back a flood of good memories. I remember I had Miss Butler in the kindergarten, Miss Banks in the first grade, and Miss Skeet in the second grade. And especially Miss Banks in the first grade was a wonderful teacher. She would allow me to come to school early at 8 in the morning and read to her for a half an hour, 45 minutes. And my mother and father both, but my mother in particular, was very diligent in teaching me to read before I even started kindergarten. So Miss Banks saw that, and she encouraged that, and it meant a lot to me. But in 1961, the New York school system, which is now the most segregated school system in the country, and of course it was very segregated at that time. We only had a very small amount of white kids in our school. I mean, a handful. They introduced a voluntary busing program, where what they would call now a minority to majority program. And my mother and father made the decision to participate in it with me. And I look back on it with mixed feelings, because I was bused from my home neighborhood to East Flatbush, a section of Brooklyn, which is now a largely West Indian neighborhood, but back then it was predominantly Jewish. And I can still remember clearly, as if it was yesterday, that first day. I was bused to a school was called PS 198, right near Albany and East 42nd Street in East Flatbush. And there was only a small group of us that were dropped off the bus at that school. And I remember the first day of school was the first Monday after Labor Day in 1961. And I remember the hostile reaction of the parents as we were dropped off the school bus. I mean, there was yelling and screaming of spitting, though I don't remember being hit, but I remember seeing that. And it was just, I had no idea what even race was at that point. My parents had shielded me from it, and I later questioned that because I was really unprepared for it. I remember going to class, and I was the only black child in my class, but it didn't mean anything to me at that time. It didn't mean anything until that first day of school during lunch hour, because during lunch, unlike PS 70 in Brooklyn, you were let out into the playground. And I remember being let out into the playground, and this boy came up to me and asked, he was obviously an older boy, "Are you a nigger?" And I had never heard the word before. I had no idea what the word meant. So I told him I didn't know. And when I came home that night, I asked my father, "Am I a nigger?" And he, of course, wanted to know where I heard that. And I told him at school that a boy had asked me that question. And he began to explain to me how, many bad people use that word. And that was the beginning of my education on what the concept of race was. And that was a quite painful experience, a very painful experience. I can remember the next month having school elections for class offices, and students nominated someone for president, and I raised my hand to nominate someone, one of the young ladies in my class who was very nice and I liked her, for vice president. And the teacher responded, "The bus children are not ready to participate in class elections." Now I was the only bus child in the class, and she told me to put my hand down, and the children in the class started laughing. And it was rather humiliating. It was really rather humiliating. But this is what it was like in this school in East Flatbush in Brooklyn. And it was only an introduction, because that following March, and I can remember the date like it was yesterday, it was March 8th, 1962, a few months later, we moved from Brooklyn to Staten Island, and it was Greenwood Moving Company. I can still in my mind see that green truck. And my family moved from 814 Jefferson Avenue, Brooklyn 21, New York, that was before zip codes, to 265 Pelton Avenue, Staten Island, New York. And it was like moving to a different state. Brooklyn was urban. We lived my family owned a brownstone. Beautiful building. It's still there. I went by to see it in that December. I went back to the neighborhood. It's a beautiful building. We moved into a two-family house, wooden structure on Staten Island, which was nice. It had more land to it. There were trees and grass. There was a vacant lot behind the lot. So it was very different from the urban environment that I was used to. And I can remember the first day of school. Again, this was in March of 1962. And my mother took me to school to register me. And my mother wanted me placed into what was called IGC class, intellectually gifted children. And I had the grades for it. I had good grades. I had extremely high test scores. And the assistant principal, Miss Veely, was the principal of PS 45 in Staten Island where I went. I don't remember the assistant principal's name. I was a child. I was next to my mother. I was a third grader. But I do remember hearing the principal say that the grades that I had, the test scores I had on the IRO tests, were impossible. And they weren't going to accept them. Even though we were the same school district, the same headquarters on Livingston Street in Brooklyn, she refused to accept my test scores and refused to put me in the gifted class. And she put me in the second class. My mother was very angry. I could feel the disdain and the condescension coming from the assistant principal. But there was nothing we could do about it. And this was the first lesson to me in how racism was and how white people use racism. They use standards when it benefits them, but when it doesn't, they often throw it out the window. So that was my experience there. Now, once I got in class, the students weren't bad. And that was one thing I must say. There were a large amount of Jewish kids. I remember after being there a month or so, the teachers were fine. Actually, the teachers, a lot of them knew my mother because she was a school teacher. not in that school, but in a school in the area. So a lot of them knew her. And so in elementary school, it wasn't that bad. I remember one of the students in the class, a very bright guy, Jewish kid, Richard Lorch. I remember he inviting me home with him to lunch. I can still remember what we ate. We ate spaghetti and brown sauce. And I had never had spaghetti with the brown sauce before, so it was real interesting to me. And it was good. And then the next time he invited me again, and we had beefaroni. And I had never had beefaroni before. You know, Chef Boyardee's beefaroni. But in the elementary school, from third grade, fourth grade, it was not bad. I mean, there were some racist incidents, but it wasn't like the school in East Flatbush in Brooklyn. And I played with the kids. I remember a guy named Paul Kingston who was very conservative. And a lot of the kids I got to know and knew into my high school years. Because about 3 or 4 of them I actually went to high school with. So it was interesting. I'm going to stop here because my junior high and high school experiences were where the racial issues became much more evident and prominent. And in high school, they became violent and brutal. But I'll leave that for a later video. You folks have a nice day, and I'll see you with part 2.